There are people that are not homeless that go to the food banks, like I have 6 children.
If agriculture is the heart of America, then in 2025, it is silently ceasing to beat. Many fields in Iowa are burning, not because of bankruptcy, but because farmers are growing crops and raising livestock that no one wants anymore while their debts keep piling up. While the slogan, "Make Agriculture Great Again," is being chanted out there, American agricultural products are being shunned by the world. Farmers are losing land, losing workers, and losing the very reason to sow and plant. And one big beautiful bill promised as a lifeline is drowning what little remains. Even food subsidies have been wiped out. Today, let me walk you through 5 horrifying truths about the American agricultural crisis that not even Trump can solve. And if you still eat one meal a day, trust me, you'll want to hear them all. Please note that this information is compiled from statistical data, not intended to defame any organization or individual. The first truth: American agriculture has been left behind from reigning power to rejection. Agriculture was once one of America's proudest pillars, not only because of the massive scale of production, but because of global trust. From the cornfields of Iowa to the cattle ranches of Texas, American farmers didn't just feed the United States, they helped shape the diets of the entire world. Countries across Asia, Europe, and Latin America, no matter how developed, once depended on U.S. seeds, quarantine standards, and the supply chains America built. U.S. agricultural products were not just food, they were the standard. For decades, the U.S. wasn't just a supplier, it was the one writing the rules. But by 2025, the unthinkable happened. Even America's closest partners began walking away. And the first turning point came from right next door Canada. As a longtime neighbor, Canada had been willing to import nearly everything from the U.S., from soybeans and beef to cabbage and powdered milk. In trade talks, they were usually the more flexible party, sometimes even taking losses to preserve regional harmony. But after a series of unilateral trade restrictions imposed by the U.S. in early 2025, something shifted. It wasn't just economic damage, it was a feeling of disrespect. Many Canadians felt like they were being treated as the 51st state, expected to follow the rules set across the border without having a voice in them. They no longer wanted their food supply chains or safety standards to be dictated by others. And then came the unexpected. The country once seen as the region's nicest neighbor boldly changed direction. From government to everyday consumers, a Buy Canadian movement swept across the country. Major supermarket chains prioritized domestic goods. U.S. agricultural products, once the default, were pushed to the bottom shelves. And the impact didn't come from protests or loud statements, but from cold, hard numbers. In just the first quarter of the year, the U.S. lost more than $2.1 billion in agricultural exports to Canada. Then the dominoes began to fall. In Asia, Japan, long viewed as one of the most loyal and patient trade partners, also quietly reevaluated the relationship. After a sudden U.S. tariff was imposed on Japanese rice, one of Japan's most sensitive commodities, Tokyo didn't respond with words. It responded with silence. But behind that silence was a strategic reset. For years, Japan had endured a lot to maintain stability, opening its doors to American beef-reducing domestic subsidies and accepting U.S. standards. But this time, seeing Canada, the quiet friend, speak up and act Japan began to ask itself, why not us? Cabinet meetings in Tokyo were held behind closed doors. And for the first time, a topic that once had no place in Japanese politics made it onto the agenda. Maybe it's time to reduce dependence on American agriculture. No one shouted, no one slammed the table, but import contracts began to shift. Beef orders moved to Australia. Soybeans and corn were sourced from Argentina. Sanitary and quarantine standards were gradually updated to align more closely with European models. For the U.S., damage was inevitable. Soybean exports to Japan fell by more than 30%. Midwest beef piled up in cold storage. States like Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa began sounding the alarm as their international contracts were under review. In Europe, the signs had been there for a while, even if they weren't loud. The EU has long been wary of GMOs, antibiotics, and pesticide residues, all of which the US permits at higher thresholds. And with US trade policy becoming increasingly unpredictable, Europe had all the reason it needed to tighten up. No one explicitly called it a boycott, but new regulations emerged: stricter inspections, tighter traceability, more rigorous labeling requirements. German, French, and Dutch consumers, already notoriously discerning, were guided by local media to believe that US imports may not meet our standards. To many, this looked like sophisticated protectionism. But to Europe, it was the right to defend both public health and strategic autonomy. In just the first half of the year, according to data from the US Department of Agriculture, USDA agricultural exports fell by more than 17% year over year. But the damage wasn't just in graphs. It was in the cold storage units full of unsold goods. In the eyes of Midwest farmers wondering where this year's harvest would go. In the sound of combines grinding to a halt mid-season because no one had signed a purchase contract. A nation can dominate through trade politics and rules. But the real fear begins when other countries start redrawing the global supply map without America at the center. And that is already happening quietly without warning, but enough to shake the throne that American agriculture had held for nearly a century. Here lies the real problem. Even for those who once vowed to make America great again, this situation is now beyond their control. No tweet can undo the loss of trust among international partners. No campaign trip can drag them back to a negotiating table they've already walked away from. When others have stepped out from America's shadow, bold declarations and slogans become nothing more than echoes of the past. One thing, however, remains unchanged. The ones suffering the most, after all is said and done, are the very people who place their faith in this land, American farmers. The second truth American farmers burn their fields stop planting. They once voted for a powerful man. With a firm voice and honeyed promises, American agriculture would not only keep its crown, but rise even higher. There would be investment funds flowing into the Midwest. There would be trade deals granting special privileges to American soybeans, beef, and corn in global markets. But the world of 2025 didn't turn out as they expected. No country was willing to be coerced anymore. No one wanted to sit at the negotiating table only to make unconditional concessions like before. And when retaliatory tariffs rolled out, the first to feel the full impact were the farmers, the very people who believed they'd be protected. Fertilizer, diesel, pesticides. Basic necessities. Farmers must buy all spiked by 30 to 40% in just the first 3 months of 2025. Simply starting up a tractor cost double compared to the previous year. Each planting season no longer felt like investing in the future, but more like a game of chance. If the crop couldn't be sold, they'd lose everything. The export market, once a saving grace, suddenly vanished. Canada no longer imported meat and soybeans like before. Japan shifted its orders to Argentina and Australia. Europe began rejecting chemically treated beef and genetically modified corn. The USDA admitted U.S. agricultural exports dropped more than 17% in the first quarter, equivalent to billions of dollars vanishing from rural America. With no buyers and rising input costs, farmers stood at a crossroads: keep producing and suffer heavy losses, or give up. And then something horrifying happened. People started burning their fields, not as protest, not to attract media attention, but because it was the least bad option. Burn the crop and insurance would pay. Continue planting and only debt would follow. You might ask, why didn't they try to save the harvest? But imagine this: you run a small farm short on labor prices soaring, the domestic market shrinking because SNAP is being cut. You grow your crop and no one buys. What would you do? They chose to burn to stop the bleeding. And then there were those who had nothing left to burn. They chose to stop. They locked the barn, folded up the cedars, and left their fields untouched. No plowing, no tilling, no irrigation. Weeds grew where rice or beans once sprouted. Planting seeds at that point was like throwing money into the dirt and waiting for bankruptcy. Idle farmland increased by 22% in just 1 quarter, according to USDA reports. Across much of the Great Plains and Midwest, the once familiar hum of tractors was replaced by silence, a chilling, uncanny silence. Because idle fields meant the entire supply chain came to a halt. Fertilizer dealers had no customers. Warehouse rental contracts were canceled. Seasonal workers lost jobs. Food processing plants went quiet. And you can see this wasn't just a farmer story anymore. It was a domino effect, pulling entire communities down with it. Then came a ray of hope, one that seemed it could save everything: Big Beautiful Bill. A massive policy package marketed as a shield for agriculture. $68 billion in crop insurance tax breaks reinvestment support. It sounded great, but put yourself in the shoes of a small farmer. Do you have enough acreage to qualify? Do you have the matching funds to be eligible for disbursement? Most do not. And the ones who benefit are the big agribusinesses, corporations owning tens of thousands of acres, packing plants and high-tech infrastructure. Big Beautiful Bill is like a hose pumping money into places already full, while the small plots, the hands that plant each bean manually, remain hungry. Worse still, to fund this relief package, the government slashed nearly $300 billion from SNAP, the food assistance program for the poor. That means the poor no longer have money for groceries. The domestic market contract's purchasing power disappears. So who's left to buy the farmer's goods? Many say at least burning fields brings compensation, but leaving the land idle, that's the real surrender. That's when you admit planting seeds only leads to more debt. The harvest can't even cover diesel costs. And the most painful part, they have no other choice. It's no surprise that in recent interviews, Many farmers whispered to reporters they regret it. Not their vote, but their belief that policy would listen to the voice of the small farmer. What they got instead was the cold indifference of the market, a hundreds-page policy document they couldn't even qualify to read, let alone benefit from. And the terrifying truth is, the fallout isn't over. When farmers stop producing, an entire rural economic ecosystem begins to crack. The processing plants, storage depots, cold warehouses, all must shut down. But that's the next chapter when we talk about factories going dark and whole communities being pushed to the margins. The third truth: factory shutdowns and the collapse of America's agricultural ecosystem. It's not gunfire, not war. Yet across the American Midwest, once vibrant agricultural communities have fallen into an eerie silence. The factories that once glowed through the night now sit abandoned as if forgotten by time. No shift whistles, no trucks departing, no hum of meat-cutting machines. Just the wind sweeping across empty parking lots and for lease signs dangling like a late farewell. It's hard to believe that only months ago, many still believed American agriculture was entering a renaissance. People rallied behind Big Beautiful Bill, speaking of rural renewal of domestic production first. But then everything collapsed with startling speed, starting with the farmers themselves. As they were forced to abandon their fields and burn their crops, the supply chain behind them began to flicker and fade. Emporia, a small town in Kansas, felt this collapse most clearly. Tyson Foods, one of the nation's largest meat processors, abruptly announced the closure of its plant. More than 800 workers lost their jobs in a single week. In Emporia, Tyson wasn't just a company, it was a heartbeat. Without weekly wages, the shops around the plant quietly shuttered. The convenience store that once stayed open late now only turns on lights in the morning. The coffee shop where workers stopped before early shifts now advertises weekend discounts that no one stops for. Everything feels cold, like winter arrived early. And Emporia is not alone. Towns like Grand Island, Nebraska, Hutchinson, Kansas, and even outlying areas in Tennessee and Iowa are feeling the same blow. The factory shuts down. People lose income, communities begin to suffocate. In Iowa, once known as America's soybean belt, the processing plants now run at only a quarter of capacity, not for lack of demand, but for lack of supply. Farmers can't sell at a profit, so they stop planting. And the machines sit idle. Trucks that once carried goods across the Midwest now run only half their routes because the more they run, the more they lose. A logistics manager in Des Moines said, "Every time a truck comes back empty, we lose a reason to exist." And it's not just crops. The poultry industry is in clinical death. Foster Farms just shut down its turkey line in Turlock, California, 519 jobs gone. Purdue Farms closed its plant in Monterey, Tennessee, cutting another 430. Each closure doesn't just silence machinery, it extinguishes the hope of hundreds of families who depended on it. Those lost wages take away tuition money, mortgage payments, health insurance. And the feeling of being abandoned is spreading. What angers many is this: it's not that the factories were unproductive. On the contrary, many were once sources of made in America pride. But now, in the eyes of executives, if there's no supply from farms, if there's no export support, if labor becomes too risky due to ICE, then they leave. They shut down. They hand back the keys to the town and walk away. You may have once driven past such a plant. Vast concrete blocks that once glowed day and night now lie dusty. The freezing chambers once filled with cold air are now damp, their metal doors rusted. Someone who once worked those machines now drives Uber in a nearby town. Someone who once hauled goods for that plant now works at a convenience store, struggling to feed 2 kids on minimum wage. This isn't a distant tale. It could be your neighbor or you if you were born in rural America. The media may call this restructuring. But for the people, this is collapse. It's a painting drained of color because when the factory stops, the town gradually drowns in silence. Worse still, international contracts, once lifelines, are being canceled. Partners from Japan, South Korea, and the EU now demand green supply chains traceable and uninterrupted. They fear U.S. risks. Strikes, ICE raids, supply shortages, sudden policy shifts. One plant that had long supplied European retailers had to pass its contract to a Canadian supplier, simply because Canada was more stable. Glen Valley Foods, a small meat plant in Nebraska, used to supply schools across the state. But after an ICE raid that arrested nearly 80 workers, the plant lost 70% of its capacity. Within 2 months, customers switched elsewhere. Once named best small business in the state, the plant is now selling off equipment to pay its debts. Worse yet, the abandoned communities have no one left to catch them. No relief package arrives in time. No special policies exist for towns that lose their economic pillars. And there's certainly no apology from the corporations that moved production overseas where they find cheaper land, more labor, and fewer regulations. They don't look back. Meanwhile, the people here still drive past the factories that once were the heart of their communities, now reduced to skeletal shells. Many had once voted with the hope that America would prioritize domestic goods, that small farmers would be supported, that intrastate supply chains would be restored. But they've watched each link break from scorched fields to silenced factories to broken export lines. And now, as Americans start to feel the disruption on their dinner tables, beef prices, rising turkeys running short fresh produce out of season, it may already be too late to save the towns that just lost their economic hearts. One truck driver once told me he'd driven for the plant for more than 20 years. Every time I saw the warehouse full, I knew I still had a reason to wake up early. That reason is gone now. The plant is closed. The truck is parked. And his internal clock, like so many others, has stopped ticking. But the scariest part is yet to come, because not all plants shut down. Some have moved abroad. They didn't turn off the machines, they just turned them on somewhere else. And that may be the next horrifying truth, that even American corporations are beginning to abandon their own homeland. The fourth truth: major corporations are fleeing the promised land. This morning the tractor wouldn't start again. Called the repair guy only to get a shake of the head. Parts aren't in yet, still waiting on a shipment from Canada. The land that once fed an entire family now waits on every screw, every oil filter from across the border. Same soil, same farmer. Only difference is the corporations that once stood shoulder to shoulder have now quietly withdrawn. In Kansas, Tyson Foods used to be a household name. A plant in Emporia once hired over 800 people running day and night. The town's main street lit up with each factory shift. Weekend markets buzzed with activity as workers had money to spend. But at the end of 2024, Tyson closed that facility. The reason: high input costs, troubled exports, and labor shortages. But behind that was a clearer decision shift focused to Mexico and Canada, where regulations are more stable, labor is cheaper, and most importantly, production isn't disrupted. They invested over $100 million USD expanding in Monterrey and added a distribution center in Ontario. Jobs in Kansas were lost, but the assembly lines still run, just no longer in the US. If Tyson rang the first bell, then Walmart was the next alarm. Anyone living in rural America knows Walmart is more than just a store. It's the local lifeline, the bridge between domestic goods and consumers. But Walmart is quietly stepping away from that role. They moved their food distribution hub to Canada, poured money into building a modern logistics chain in Ontario, rolled out automated refrigerated trucks, robotic sorting systems, and expanded key stations in Toronto. The shopping baskets of people in the Midwest now contain more and more labels reading "Product of Canada," hard to notice unless you're looking. But for farmers in Nebraska, Iowa, or Missouri, it's crystal clear their goods are being replaced. Some say, isn't business just about going where the profits are? And yes, that's fair. But the real question is, why are more and more corporations choosing Canada? Canada hasn't done anything flashy. They've just been consistent lower taxes, clear investment support, straightforward procedures, and most importantly, stability. In the US, every change in administration leaves businesses saying, let's wait and see what the new policy brings. In Canada, things stay on course. No drama, no threats. And that quiet reliability is what draws people in. John Deere understands this well. The right to repair battle in the US forced the company to unlock its software so users could fix their own tractors. But that opened risks in safety warranties and equipment management. Rather than fight it, they opened a major facility in Alberta, Canada, gradually shifted parts production there, and now operate a North American parts warehouse from the north. So now, in the Midwest, when a machine breaks down, orders go to Canada. Not because it can't be made here, but because the company simply doesn't make it here anymore. ADM and Cargill, the titans of the agricultural supply chain, are also quietly retreating from the US. Cargill kept its plant in Fort Morgan, Colorado, but it now runs at partial capacity. The rest of its operations flow to Brazil and Canada. ADM, after merging with Bunge Viterra, shifted capital toward foreign procurement, abandoning long-term contracts in the Midwest because the competitive edge is no longer there. Corn, soybeans, wheat, they haven't disappeared. They just don't leave American soil anymore. All of this raises a painful question among the people. If America is the promised land, why are the leading birds flying away? No one dares answer that. But everyone is thinking it. People have begun whispering comparisons. In Canada, businesses don't worry about sudden tax changes. Workers get retraining support, new factories get clean land, utilities, and long-term commitments. Meanwhile, in the US, the federal government says one thing while the states do another. One moment they encourage local agriculture, the next they slash support budgets. One year they tighten immigration, the next they loosen it. All of it making it hard for businesses to plan ahead. Rural Americans don't ask for much. They just want to know, will someone buy the meat I raise next year? If my tractor breaks down, will someone fix it? Will the banks still give out loans? But now even they are unsure. Worse still, the workforce is starting to leave. Capital flight is one thing, but labor flight is what really deepens the wound. Many John Deere repair technicians have asked to transfer to Canadian branches. Young people trained in agricultural logistics are applying to firms headquartered in Ontario instead of staying in their hometowns. Some families are selling their land, pooling money so their kids can head north. There are no more opportunities here. Of course, the White House is aware, but in the current climate, with all resources focused on controlling inflation, handling price crises, and adjusting import policies, the exodus of major corporations isn't a top priority. Even the powerful man known for his tough stance on corporate America, this time couldn't stop the tide of offshoring. All he can do, it seems, is go on TV and say America is still strong, but for rural folks, what they need isn't a slogan. It's a buy or a job, a reason to stay. No one is pointing fingers. No one is truly to blame for choosing to go where life and business are easier. But when all the big players choose to leave, what happens to the small ones who remain? You might still see shelves full at the supermarket, but now that fullness no longer comes from the farm next door. And sure, you can still buy cheap meat, but do you know where it came from? The answer perhaps will become clearer when we face the final consequence, when people not only lose their land, but also lose their meals. The final truth. Americans are hungry.
According to government data, nearly 50 million Americans lack consistent access to food. Many depend on the charity of food banks.
You don't realize you're hungry just because your stomach growls. Sometimes hunger begins with an everyday choice, choosing cheaper bread because a child needs medicine this week, then gradually buying less produce, reducing meat, cutting out milk. At some point, you look at the family meal and no longer recognize it as yours. This is not just your story. It's a silent crisis spreading across America where food was once cheap, abundant, and a symbol of plenty. Now every meal becomes an equation how to get enough nutrition and quantity without blowing the monthly grocery bill. Rising food prices are no longer a feeling but a clear reality. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the category meat, poultry, fish, and eggs rose by 6.1% over 6 months. Eggs, a staple once taken for granted, have jumped over 40%, forcing many low-income families to switch to less nutritious substitutes. But even paying more doesn't guarantee quality. In 2025, the US government ended its tax moratorium with Mexico, the main importer of tomatoes and produce. As a result, tomato prices could rise by 50% from July. Familiar items like salads, pizzas, or burgers will become more expensive simply because one ingredient that was once cheap isn't anymore. And that's not all. Proposed 50% tariffs on beef from Brazil, which accounts for over 1/5 of US beef imports, could make burgers even more unaffordable. Price hikes don't just reduce portions, they threaten quality. Some supermarket chains are turning to suppliers with looser safety standards. Americans now wonder, where did this meat come from? Is it inspected? Meanwhile, big companies like Conagra, dominating processed food brands, are exploiting their position to raise prices further. They warn of another 7% increase next year due to tariffs and logistics costs. Worse, consumers have few alternatives. As the market concentrates in fewer hands, consumer choice shrinks. Today's meal isn't decided by taste, but by what remains on the shelf at an acceptable price. This is how stable families become food insecure without realizing it. In cramped grocery stores, you'll see long lines of Americans, from single mothers and factory workers to retirees, waiting at food banks. Feeding America reports demand is up 120% compared to 3 years ago. Sadly, this is happening as the SNAP budget, the nutritional lifeline for millions, is being drastically cut, with total cuts projected at $186 billion by 2034. When the government tightens, people tighten their belts. According to the USDA, 6.5 million households with children don't have enough food daily. In a nation that leads global food production, a record 47 million Americans, 14 million of whom are children, face food insecurity. This is not a statistic, it's a shame. This summer, in cities like San Francisco, Detroit, or Philadelphia, places not associated with hunger, you'll see children lined up for subsidized snacks. No longer rare scenes in impoverished rural towns, but visible in major cities. Milwaukee, Chicago, Houston have all launched public supermarkets to fight food desert zones where no fresh food stores exist within walking distance. The situation is so serious that many Americans are looking north. In border states like Michigan, Montana, and New York, a new trend emerges, traveling to Canada to buy food, partly due to price differences, but also trust. Many now believe Canadian food produced to stricter European-like standards might be safer and more nutritious. Border region supermarkets are stocking more Canada-grown items, and in states like Oregon and Minnesota, Some chains have started pilot programs for imported Canadian goods because people demanded it. Of course, some worry, should foreign goods be trusted? Is this a sign of failed US food systems? Meanwhile, others think differently. If Canadian burgers cost more but help me avoid diabetes in a few years, maybe it's worth it. As trust in domestic systems erodes, consumers seek what they believe to be better even if it comes from across the border. The saddest truth is, many no longer believe the government can help. Regardless of who sits in the White House or which senator speaks in Congress, meals are something each family must manage on their own. While awaiting macro solutions, Americans choose small steps, shrinking meals, switching to Canadian brands, teaching kids to eat simply. It's a way to hold on to control in a world spinning out of reach. Sometimes big crises begin not with headline events, but from a misplaced vote to bold a demand or a campaign promise launched mid-election. But U.S. farming foundations of life, economy, and trust is not something you can lightly shake and expect it to rebalance itself. Now that loss is no longer on a chart or a farmer's ledger, it sits on your dinner table. The question now is, what do you think? Do you still believe America puts your family at the center? This video does not promote division or secession. All content is offered to explore, analyze, and spark constructive discussion based on facts, feelings, and current social trends. We respect the U.S. Constitution and all federal regulations.